Hello. Articulation for Bach on the piano seems to be a recurrent subject. How do you end the sound? Not only how do you start the sound, how do you prepare for the decay, or how do you anticipate the articulation of the enunciation for rhetorically persuasive eloquence? As most of the Baroque music of Bach, though universal beyond its type of time-framed Baroque by our studies of universal knowledge of music, but then compartmented. It's spoken more than sung. Of course, it's melodic, though it's the harmony that holds with the bass movement, the pattern, for instance, like the Goldberg Variations aria based on a genre of sarabande, short, long gesture for the choreography. Therefore, the harmonic progression of the descending tetrachord is from the lament. And therefore, you can say that the melody comes beautifully, called aria for that purpose. But in the variations, 30 of them that follow, most of it is digital bliss. And therefore you have a lot of short tones. The legato in the concept on the harpsichord is more about what they call bleeding or overholding. And if you have a shorter decay, then inevitably you might have to restrike. And Bach didn't shy a lot about writing long values on the harpsichord that had a shorter decay than the organ, where, except when the bellows person, I guess, was absent, Bach didn't have any air in the pipes, but when he did, it didn't decay. And so the organ works of Bach that have a long holding bass played by the pedals note on the first of book 2 of the Preludes for Harpsichord. Unless you replay, it would have been gone. And if you restrike it on the beat or off the beat, it depends how it corresponds to the phrasing of the articulation of the right hand. It goes back to this idea that Bach's music is sung, of course, lyrically through the arias, especially the 25th variation in minor, which has the same genre as the slow movement of the Italian concerto. So the vocal beauty of his writing for instrumental elements without, let's say, the syllables and the words of the sacred music of his, like the chorales and especially the cantatas and the motets. But the liturgical fugues like Book 2, even if it comes in a quotation that he doesn't acknowledge, of Caspar Fischer's Ariadne Musicae. And some of the fugues are written to be very articulated fast, like the G major, reminiscent of the well-tempered, but in this case of the Goldberg. Book 1, So yes, he develops this, I would say, digital jubilant bliss. But in terms of the legato and the non-legato or the staccato, or all these subtle in-between nuances of the dynamic range, which at the time didn't determine the expression of the harpsichord, but the length of the sound in a bowed or sung way that imitated on the harpsichord as if it was, and it is, to be considered as character piece, where you imitate, like Rameau, the chicken, la poule. Most of the time, the proper sounding instrument music for harpsichord was series of dances or series of songs. And inevitably, the harpsichord played also fugues, which is the pure music that doesn't imitate a dance or a singing element. And the fugues can be, as we said, faster, articulated lightly or not, and therefore the idea for pianists that is legato or non-legato is way beyond that binary. It can be wet legato, wet staccato, air legato, almost tenuto. It all depends of how you floss the notes in between, like the teeth, and you have some kind of articulation that is very crisp, bordering on staccato. If you retract the fingers under the palm as soon as played. Of course, take into account also the quality of the length of the sound of the modern pianos, which you play, with combination of the acoustics in which it's set. So you realize that you can go further in the legato than the harpsichord, therefore in the adagio of the stretching of the syllables, not even suggested words, in an unnatural slow tempo for a harpsichord. But of course, since you play on the piano, you don't want to make an imitation, but you want to understand what is universal from what is specific to the instrument, to the time period. Of course, it's anachronistic to think about how Bach would have liked to play or suggest to be played on the modern piano, where you have certain enhancements compared to the harpsichord, but in the same time a loss of subtlety of articulation like the harpsichord. For instance, the bowings were by 2 or 4 notes in the Baroque bowing without the screw and the tension of the horsetails bow hair. And then you can obtain with the romantic bow and modern bow these longer groups, perhaps 16/16 notes in a single bow stroke or down upper stroke. But in the Baroque, it was continuously in a fast bow. It was a flow of 3, 4, perhaps 2, but not more. In the single ti, and so inevitably you had that feeling that the harpsichord imitates the voice or the instruments with which it plays in concert, as Rameau called his pièce de concert pièce de clavecin en concert rather. Harpsichord pieces in concert, which means in agreement. You could hear la cupice for harpsichord, the arpeggiation, or then you could add a flute part or another violin part. And so it's a modular concept that Rameau developed earlier than us, obviously. The idea is that the first prelude by Bach is also just the arpeggios without a melodic line or thematic material, and the bass line is your track, like train tracks. And of course you have a melody that can appear, and it does, but it's not necessarily a melody that's harmonized, which is the case for the aria. most of the time is a melodic line, like Book 1 C sharp minor, that has patterns of decorative melodic lines, but the bass goes to the leading tone, tonic dominant. Yes, so the music was really written and thought and organized from the bottom up in the Baroque era until Bach's death in 1750, where we, for the sake of organizing this universal knowledge of music that we are teaching and learning, way more than, unfortunately for them, the composers of the past had access to their own past music. Monteverdi or von Bingen were lesser known to Bach himself than to us. But then, because we have access and we have teachings and we have developed programs to study in such a niches of such a distant times of music with or without the context of the instrument or the historically informed performance on the modern instrument with the bowed, phrased organization of groups of 16th notes. Of course, the hemiola organization of the 6/8 and the 3/4 in the first variation of the Goldberg, with the 3/4 on the top, 2 times 3 on 3 times 2. And these are suggested hints, really it's a redundancy, but to mention it, not so much demonstrative articulations of syncopation, which then become a little bit vulgar in my opinion, because then you try to enhance too much what is hinted. Oops, sorry, that didn't mean bitonal. By pulse, it's already not bad to get 3/4 and 6/8, but in G both. But even if you play both in 3/4, is very beautiful. Everything is beautiful when Bach writes, because there is a sense of grace in the organization of the structure, in the expression of the group of notes. Everything is so civilized and organized, even when he has this plethoric amount of superimposed layers of voices. He reaches this kind of of the division of the voices, multiplying and dividing your brain into many layers that you follow at the same time, or the simplicity of articulation. Like D major book 1, where you have this group of 16th notes running, 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1, 1 being an upbeat, not the downbeat as we think of it, except the arrival point at the very end. But all the other first beats of bars are the fourth of a group of 4 that starts in the pattern of the design of the decoration from the second of the group of 4 16th notes a beat. 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 is not purposely accenting it for the being devil's advocate, but you have this sense of constant regeneration of the perpetual motion that de facto Bach puts in place for the pulse flow. And to go back to the articulation, how do we choose what to do? Is to do with the genre, with the evocation of a given dance, of the Baroque, of course, and also the evocation of the aria. In other words, the harpsichord with the fugue probably gets to have its own genre that is not related to imitating. But even so, you have to have a groupment of raised notes. For instance, the prelude, like the first one, everybody knows of book 1. he writes whole note or half note rather, and then dotted quarter, and then these 16th notes not. Therefore, played on the harpsichord was called bleeding. When you overhaul the notes, you obtain this legato where you have a part of harmony until the triad, and then the 6/4 of the chord, the articulation arpeggio. In fact, is to obtain a legato that with acoustics resonance enhances the harmonization and then lets the interval alone. So it's like a bowed 3 notes and then the lighter notes up there. Of course, that is inevitably more obvious in the solo cello suite, where he uses open strings with resonance of fifths, and he obtains the triad and then the 16th note, just like. So he incorporates the harmonization, the melody, through the improvisation of a pattern that would be, in this case, an arpeggio. But then it's not arpeggiation that is an accompaniment to a melody. Like Gounod did. To a certain extent, the arpeggio in Bach is the emanation of the melodic bass. To schematize the motion of the bass line, and not so much another schematization. The arpeggios by themselves carry the harmony, but also a melodic emanation from the harmonic bass line called moving bass continuo. In the post-Baroque, early elegant classicism or first Viennese school, we have the style galant, and Mozart writes a lot of accompaniments which are, of course, experienced from the Alberti bass, which is another way to arpeggiate the triad, but with a pulse system with a downbeat group of 16th notes, 4 in each beat. But when he wants, and he does in K310, this A minor sonata written in Paris supposedly after the loss of his mother, because some people consider that is a fact, others think that it's perhaps anecdotic, but in any case, let's not constantly try to connect the personal life of the creator with their creation, which in many aspects is bigger than them. But of course, they experience their own lives of pain, how much of it is expressed in the piece. In this time era where you come from the formal into the breaking of the formal into the romantic era, later 19th century, of course, when you hear the Chopin second sonata, agitation, emotion, drive, anxiety. It's almost a signature of the hero that talks about himself, describing his state of mind. And you don't have that in Haydn Sonata. Though he was incredible to even dare to do the first strike of the orchestra musicians' lost wages, and he wrote a protest symphony, the farewell one, and that was risk-taking when musicians were slaves of their owners, like Esterhazy in Vienna in the case of Haydn. So he did have an inner life, but he didn't make it demonstratively. Very often it was his expression of his own soulful or his social act. In this case, that was a demonstrative factor. But in most of his music, you don't know what is his mood compared to expressing the human universally the human anxiety, excitement, drive, passion, unstoppable, irrational excitement. And of course, if Mozart did as he did write this with his forcing chords accompaniment rather than the appoggiaturas, or the, of course, appoggiaturas are in the right hand, or accacciaturas from under, the port de voix, and not, well, he has on both sides, but not the note itself. But the accompaniment in Beethoven, it's also repeated notes in Mozart K310 or in the chicken. The repeated notes in Rameau, repeated notes in Mozart, repeated notes in Beethoven, chordal left hand, or only pattern in the Waldstein, which incorporates the thematic material, the melodic line, the pulse, the ostinato, and at the same time the structure of the texture of the first theme of the Waldstein Sonata, exactly like Bach in the first prelude, generic repertoire coming from playing arpeggio to establish a tonality before the fugue, which is the purpose of the prelude. Visiting the main degrees, second or fourth, fifth for sure, and then one, to establish the hierarchy through the cadences of the tonality in which you're gonna play the fugue. In each key, inevitably, especially the lesser known ones that were lesser used before the unison tuning of Zilberman, who made it possible to play on a single tuned harpsichord in every key and not only all the suite of dances in the same key. So the tuning, the articulation, the phrasing, the instrumental expectation of length of sound or equality or inequality of the notes. On the modern piano we practice scales to sound equal with the uneven length of fingers and the keys according to the different topography of the tonalities between the black and the white keys. So yes, it's all about sounding even. Whenever in the harpsichord and CPE, the second born, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, of his son composers once, wrote an essay about performance on the harpsichord, and the scales are played and demonstrated in fingers with 2-3-4 or 3-4-3-4. Not that they had to avoid the thumb, as anecdotically we're told about Bach being the first one to use. I assume mostly because on two keyboards he would hold with the thumb on the lower keyboard and play on the top. And that's not proven either. Who knows? After all, what matters is how they thought the music, and I think and Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and many of the composers who wrote for a keyboard instrument, would it be harpsichord into fortepiano, into modern piano, with the later composers that made it so virtuosic, like Liszt, Chopin, and then Scriabin, Rachmaninoff. But in a way, Haydn and Beethoven and Schubert, to a certain extent, also, who were not all fluent pianists. I mean, of course, Bach played also the violin, but so did Mozart play the viola as well as the harpsichord into the fortepiano for his late piano concerti that he demonstrated. But ultimately, the genre in which they wrote depended too much or very much of what they thought the instrument can produce. And in a way, they were not really limited by it. If Bach didn't write Book 2, he expected to restrike it. So where would he write tied whole notes on a harpsichord? He knew very well it's not the organ. But I think it's because they, like Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart, they wrote through the keyboard instrument, symphonic, operatic, narrative, Tchaikovsky, ballet, incidental music for theater or for dance, the chamber music of Mozart with the violas is chromatic, complex, subtle. The piano sonatas written for patrons' daughters or who were students of his were written with more simplicity of the approach of the texture. So we have different levels of involvement of what makes them. Of course, melodists like Mozart and Schubert and it's a fountain of youth, of melodization. Every song of Schubert, every piece of Schubert, even that's not sung, has unforgettable melodic signature. It's like a perfume that you smelled at some garden and it stays in you all your life, and you go, oh, such beautiful, like the arpeggione. So yes, the articulations are to do with the eloquence in which you express yourself. And I would say for the Baroque, yes, there is song and dance by the genre, but is also layered by the polyphony. And the tempi, of course, can be extended today on the modern piano because of the delayed decay. On the harpsichord, the decay happens by itself. So you focus on the articulation of the projection of the production of each note. And when you want to speak the sound, so to say, spielen, as the Germans said, play, but C.P.E. Bach in his Versuch, in that essay I mentioned earlier, he calls it fantasieren am Klavier, imagine on the keyboard, like improvise. And the idea of the uneven on the harpsichord is jeu inégal, as the French call it. Of course, all notes are equal, but not. They're hierarchized harmonically by the dominants and the tonics and the subdominants, and so you have a different way of looking at it through this fifth under the tonic and the circle of fifths. That's the plagal cadence, weaker because not having the leading tone, and the perfect cadence, which incorporating it creates with the leading tone a tight so-called tritone, devil in music, tension, release. Yes, there is a hierarchy of the sounds in the tonal system, or tonal center, when you start getting out of it later in the early 20th century. Atonalism or bitonalism into serialism, where you organize your own order of notes, but then you don't relate universally to the others. After all, they adapted and customized their expression through the centuries on the same rules of hierarchy of the harmonic progressions, with melodic freedom and some alterations that bring flat sevens and flat or sharp six in minor, and then in the series variations by Mendelssohn, you have ascending minor and descending, and Bach full of it too. So you had the subtlety to adapt to your personal expression in your time period, in your area geographically of Europe where you were for at least 3 centuries almost until the early 20th. Where the tonal system evolving remained universal. It's an inheritance that they didn't have to contradict at its core, but adjust or adapt and develop according to their psyche and their expression and what they want to leave for us or for themselves. Of course, they don't think of us directly, but there is this kind of opportunity to play on the harpsichord music as they must have heard it, which is so beautiful, to go for the authenticity, because you want to know how they heard the piece you like so much. And you play it on the today's piano the way you like it, even if it's not authentic, but that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it on the side different. It takes another dimension, perhaps to a certain extent betray, but not really. If not, then you shouldn't be allowed to touch a repertoire other than on a given instrument only. And I find that universality of the piano is to work on the articulation so that you prepare not only the the note that you play, but when you leave the note that you played, and then you have the opening of the chromatic fantasy and fugue as a tirata gesture or the bode. And then the unevenness gives an expression on the harmonic notes inside the melodic notes. Just like. Now, it doesn't mean that everything has to be syncopated, accented, subphrased, and short phrased, just because, yes, that is the aesthetic of an instrument in a time period of the hearing, the bowing, the singing, the phrasing. And then you have. An endless phrase in sort of continuous sentence in Rachmaninoff or in Fauré. A run-on sentence with an endless horizon line. Or then you go back into the Baroque classical, and you're organized by group of notes or group of bars. Especially, for instance, in Chopin, when he's old-fashioned writing a scherzo. What you have is group of bars, 4 bars, 8 bars, 12 bars, 16 bars. You don't hear it, but it's embedded, and so in a way it gives you this tracks. It's almost like as if it suggests its GPS to the listener without the score. And because of the tonal connections, when he's in D flat minor, second theme, it's in D flat major, and therefore in the recap he keeps it in major. That makes him end in the principal key, acknowledging the first theme. And then what happens? You start in E flat minor, so you use that tonic as the dominant, which ends on the relative major of itself, which is G flat major, from which you start the character piece in a sonata that Chopin wrote with the funeral march before the final movement. The perpetual motion of fast notes about the wind of the winter wind on the graveyard. All kinds of suggestive titles for imagination, but as Mademoiselle would have said, Boulanger, as well as Stravinsky often used to say provocatively, music only expresses what it tells itself. It doesn't need to be only the expression of an emotion, but you do connect to it. Such, you go with Rondo in minor, A minor, Mozart, tenderness. But it's also what it is: chromaticism, patterns of breathing, phrasing. So the articulation is more than the dynamic range, the first and leveled expression of the emotion and the clarity of elocution. And then you add to that the fortepiano after the harpsichord, which adds the dynamic effect of contrast, like the Pathétique sonata. And when you take the same C minor, and Beethoven must have obviously known the second partita, French overture, the Sinfonia. It's also dramatic with dotted rhythm, French overture style. But in the case of Bach, you have displayed arpeggiated chordal progression, demonstration rather, but not so much on the contrast of forte and piano. It was more about the articulation. synthesis of all of these information about length of sound, length of phrasing, decay of the sound, combined spoken or sung, danced or layered polyphony, or all the above, and the way you hear intuitively the music before you are taught this genre, this time period in the universal studies of every genre, for as deep as you can go, and perhaps sometimes in the niche very deep in a single one of them. When you play, you teach, you share, you conduct, you compose, you improvise, you write, you transcribe, and sometimes you transmit in a way through your playing or through your explanation or through a theory book or a treatise or an article, the thought processes that is to nourish your understanding of the interpretation of a piece without to impose one. After all, you have to create your own out of all what you have received or compared to or heard from, and without to be overwhelmed to the point to which you don't know which way to play because you seem to have lost what in the first place drove you to the piece. Perhaps the drive, the emotion of it, or just the well-being in this ecosystem of this escaping world in which we like to daydream while we live our daily life in another time period, inevitably so. Of course, the music of the past was their own present one, and they studied little, with the little access they had to the music of their own past, or at least other regions of their globe in terms of the culture, the oral tradition, the knowledge of the different styles that are developed either because of cross-pollination through Europe of musicians going through Italy, France, Germany, Holland, all the areas where classical music was developing, Spain as well, of course, harpsichord organ, portative organ, of course, church music, and then non-church music. And all these things are very important to be taught, very important to be learned, and I would say very important to be forgotten. Once you have learned really, you have to forget because you become it. And so you don't self-censor, but in a way you do, by saying, oh, I shouldn't do this and that, or this style doesn't call for this, or mezzo forte in Schubert is not a mezzo forte in Rachmaninoff. It seems an obvious fact, but when you study and you look at the score of the written indications, then you argue which edition is more trustworthy, and some less, some more. And then you look at when available on the photocopy of the manuscripts, and you see that even there is not much said, because most of it was played in the time period during which it was written. Therefore, you didn't have to explain how to, unless you want to leave a trace, which is what probably CPE did without Versuch, because people didn't speak much of interpretation in the Baroque, since the performer was the composer and the composer was the performer. So there was no alternative of interpretation, literally translation, right, etymologically, of a given piece. And of course, there were very few, like Goldberg playing this, studying as a student, these variations that he played for his job to play music for this gentleman who had insomnias. And it's rare to name a piece after the performer of it. Mostly it's by the patron, like Waldstein, then Goldberg, who was the player. But in any case, music can have a purpose, music can have a program, music is often connected to ecosystem of social interaction, of necessity to invent storytelling, film music, ballet music, opera, different time periods to combine the dance, the singing, the playing, the writing of words and music, and combine them in a way that they're intertwined, and so beautifully so that you listen to a Bach cantata, a Schubert song, a melody by Fauré, and a lead by Schumann, and you realize that what drove them all was beyond their instruments, beyond their time period. They wrote something that was in fact bigger than them, or taller than them, or in a way besides them, and they were sort of the vectors of that inspiration that came and was shaped by very little in compared to today's times of studies, because also partly, I assume, not directly, but I assume it is an impatience to reach a certain maturity early, because life was short in the expectancy of the time. And well, it's not guaranteed long today, but still in average it is longer. So you can study longer, you can develop longer, because it takes also longer if you want universally to learn so much about the past and still maintain the flame drive that brings you to play, not only with the knowledge, but that the knowledge in a way shapes your original attraction, love, passion for the combination of the sounds and pulse and rhythms, and you don't even know how to call them when it calls you. And most of pianists who started piano early play the piano, and the piano can play an orchestra score, a song, or a piano piece, not only what's written for it. In a way, the perception of music, if a child starts early the piano, obliged or by passion, or continuing, not discontinuing according to the schedules of one's life, some continue, some stop, some pick it up again after. Music is really soundtrack of our lives, and when you can perform it, play it, study it, learn it, read it basically first, and then try to reimagine it, even if it's already existing today compared to the past, through all the recordings and availabilities of even instant performances that we hear online, not only recorded concepts of the pieces, but also of pieces played by people from the past. So now we have competitive interpretations. Imagine that. When people barely rehearsed, they just read their music, and the playing was sharing, and the audience was involved in a interactive. Of course, it was an elite of the very few who could read and understand music, and therefore through philosophy, through humanities, and of course through a certain elitism to show that their culture brings them to understand, so in a way, attempt to understand all the concepts of the meaning of life and the world and in which they live. And it is true that the composers left us incredibly, finally, timeless music, even if we want to define it within time periods in order to assign them the given articulation, phrasing, fingering, pedaling, the harmonic pedaling, the melodic pedaling, the non-pedaling, the substitutions to make up for organizing when you run out of fingers, so to say. All this is fascinating and exhilarating at the same time, isn't it? That's why I'm so driven to teach.